In my time on Master Duel, I'll frequently run into low-powered decks, often Blue Eyes or Raw, and I'll have this reaction. Of course it's Blue Eyes. Of course it's Blue Eyes. Why would it be anything but Blue Eyes? And I'm certainly not alone in this reaction either.
There's just no way. In the rank up, come on. No, it's, no shot.
Why is the reaction to a different choice of deck anger and resentment, especially in the case of a seemingly easy win? In my video, Turn Skips and Why They Aren't As Bad As You Think, we examine how different strategies in Yu-Gi-Oh! Can earn the ire of players as immoral choices despite being perfectly legal within the rules of the game and not so different from the other strategies which have been deemed moral. This time I want to try to examine the social relations behind that imposed morality. First up, a brief recap. Yu-Gi-Oh! As a trading card game of course has rules that tell you how to play, but it does not dictate in any way how you play as long as you don't break those fundamental rules. You can play any strategy that uses cards currently legal for play, even if the deck is unplayably bad. However, once you enter the competitive scene or play on any of the online simulators with a ladder where the bounds of competitive and casual blend, playing a sufficiently subpar deck or playing a deck that a player conceives of as unfair or unfun will draw a significant amount of hate. What is a moral or immoral deck to play is relative to each player, personalized to their likes and dislikes, and often hypocritical in consideration of the decks that they play. Despite these differences, there tends to be general trends of what decks are hated in the forms of two camps. The competitive, who engages almost exclusively in the goal-oriented instrumental play, which we'll get back to, and the casual, who engages in prelapsarian nostalgia for a version of Yu-Gi-Oh! That may never have truly existed outside of their specific playground environment. This is the divide between your sighing at seeing Whitestone of the Ancients and your no synchro, no ixies, no pen, no link duel rooms. There's also like a third camp of alt format advocates, specifically the kind who likes them because they dislike modern Yu-Gi-Oh's main format, who kind of overlap a little bit with both the casual and competitive camps too. Regardless of where a player falls though, the behavior towards the player of the immoral deck remains mostly the same, complaining and whining on the light end, outright hate on the other. It's important to note that competitive and casual are not used as pejoratives here, but as descriptors. I'm not attempting to categorize players as leets or noobs here, or judge anyone's play preferences. I'm merely using these descriptive terms to categorize the different styles of play. Now that we're all on the same page, let's ask the question of the hour. Where does this behavior come from? To answer this, first let's talk about paratext. Chapter 1. Paratext. Paratext is a concept developed in 1991 by French literary critic Gérard Genette. Using the French prefix para, as seen in the term paramilitary, Genette describes paratexts in the context of books, as everything outside the text, used here in an academic sense meaning the story itself, that affects your reading of the text. This can include the title, the cover art, and assorted contextual details that shape the way you interpret a work, like knowledge about the author, the time period, or other works in the genre. Genette specifically intended this framework to be used in the context of books, but later academics have expanded upon this in the context of internet and video games. I think this is the approach that is most applicable to Yu-Gi-Oh! In its current incarnation, as it sits at the nexus of an internet culture, a video game, and a physical trading card game. From Peter Lunenfeld to Mia Consalvo, we can now understand paratext to include a much wider field where the paratext, the digital media, will often greatly outweigh the text. This includes forums, guides, and of course, YouTubers. Dan Olson and Choice applied this framework of paratext in the video Why It's Rude to Suck at Warcraft to examine, well, why it's rude to suck at Warcraft. I think this framework also applies to the question of why it's rude to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Wrong. The thing is, while in Warcraft the specific way the community is set up has coalesced into essentially one correct way to play, Yu-Gi-Oh! Instead has several cliques or philosophies of play. The difference can largely be attributed to the structure of play. Warcraft is a collaborative game. While there is PvP, the highest echelon of the game is raiding, where a guild works together against the challenge the devs set before them. As Olson and Choice point out, the best practices of high-skilled WoW play, as determined by the paratext of influential guides or YouTubers, requires everyone on the team to be on board, making mass adoption of the standard best practice in instrumental play more common. The mass adoption is exponentially increased by the devs adjusting difficulty of new raids to match the high-skilled play the best guilds are using, meaning everyone else has to adopt these best practices to catch up. Yu-Gi-Oh! On the other hand is an adversarial game. While players may work together in deck building or testing, ultimately your duel is between you and your opponent. Your opponent, much like the devs of Warcraft, determines the amount of fun you will have by what and how they play. Thus, duelists are likely to form cliques of like-minded players to play with rather than play unfun games for both players over and over again. This creates echo chambers of paratext that don't necessarily reflect the echo chambers that formed on the other side of the community. Thus, casual and competitive players generally self-select away from each other. The rare places where they overlap cause a bit of friction, as their different understandings of what is fair or fun butt against each other. Let's take a step back now, though, to come back to the idea of paratext and how it applies to Yu-Gi-Oh! The Yu-Gi-Oh! Community engages in paratext through several different avenues, almost innumerable. But as primary examples, we have the anime, oddly enough, Yu-Gi-Tubers like myself, Discord servers, Pojo and Zodiac, or forums in general, and in-person play, particularly locals where players interact on the regular, possibly every week or more. There's also stuff like testing circles, card markets, and alt formats, etc., but the vast majority of players are most likely to engage with those primary 5 paratexts. The anime in particular is an interesting example just for how clearly it shows how the paratextual relationship runs both ways, seeing as the card game certainly informs how you see the anime as well. As for how the anime colors your relationship with the card game, we need to go back a little bit to the 1980s so I could tell you how Ronald Reagan created Yu-Gi-Oh! The anime. Before Reagan's election, America had regulations on the degree to which cartoons and TV shows meant for children could advertise. Upon being elected, Reagan's administration immediately tore down that regulation, unleashing waves upon waves of cartoons meant not only to sell the things in the commercials between the show, but also the little guys in the show itself. Despite this being a change in American regulation, it had global consequences. Japanese animation studios were the ones animating these toy cartoons because the labor was cheaper than American animators. The great success of these marketing campaigns turned cartoons, combined with the rise of otaku collecting culture in Japan, changed the market as a whole, leading to some of our favorite monster-catching anime. While Yu-Gi-Oh! Began life as a manga with no cards to accompany it, the anime and the card game were being produced contemporaneously. The anime thus pushes the cards, which becomes increasingly obvious in the filler episodes that were not direct adaptations of Kazuki Takahashi's work. This feeling of being pushed new cards continues through the entirety of GX, where every problem is solved by a new card being pulled out of Jaden's ass. This attempted memification, and here I'm using meme in the academic sense, not an internet lingo sense, has stuck many of these cards in people's minds. This leads to the role player subtype of the casual group who just wants to play their favorite anime cards regardless of how they stack up to the rest of the card pool. The anime doesn't just sell specific cards though, it also sells the concept of every card being worth collecting and playing.
I'm just so glad that someone other than me can see the true value of these cards.
Well, I never met a card I didn't like.
Huh?
You see, every card is special, and you just have to learn to appreciate its power in order to figure out how to best use it.
This idea is also found in the Pokemon community, where it similarly causes a divide between casual and competitive communities. I don't think the anime exclusively contributes to the casual community though. The want, the desire to be like Yugi or Jaden or Yusei, I guess, can also be a push even just on the subconscious level to improve your game and get on that competitive scene. That same urge might drive someone to go to YouTube to look up some competitive advice. Yugi-tubers as a paratext have a very direct influence on the way people feel about the game. When your favorite Yugi-tuber scoffs at a deck, yells at a set 5 pass, or tells you that their Blue Eyes deck is tier 0, they're changing your perception of the game and passing their behaviors and opinions onto you. Those learned behaviors, often played up for the camera, are really shitty in person. You'll notice just how awful the stream chat generally is for Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments as an example. It's very similar to the Twitch chat of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Stream when talking about the streamer's opponent. That's the kind of culture that gets built without much intention. There's not really much of a solution to this though, as the reaction from the Yugi-tuber makes for good content. This creates a feedback loop of toxicity in the competitive community. Toxicity is not unique to the competitive scene though. The casual scene has their own echo chambers in the form of archetype discords. Now, some discords are more competitive minded and have their own similar problems with echo chambers, but generally speaking, the less competitive the deck, the less competitive the server. While some in these servers will be working to make the deck as strong as possible in the current competitive environment, an attitude of being superior to the meta sheep can pervade them. It's easy to just play a good deck, you see, but a bad deck requires hard work to win with. This can also feed into a deck purity culture where people get mad if the deck isn't pure enough. Do I even need to talk about the ghost trick thing? Okay, let's talk about the ghost trick thing. So, in February 2022, Yugi-tuber MBT made a deck profile titled Ghost Trick, which featured very few ghost tricks, a famously bad archetype. For some reason, this made people very upset. Looking back at the deck is almost quaint considering how the Ghost Trick combo is normally used today. His deck not only plays main deck Ghost Trick monsters, but it ends with the field spell and the link one on field, which is much more Ghost Trick per capita than is typical today. Despite this, the Ghost Trick community from the Archetype Discord hated this. Not only did they hate on this deck in their own server, they and other Ghost Trick fans brought that hate into the comments for MBT to see directly. You know, if you actually looked at his comments, which probably the right thing to do. I should stop looking at mine. So here we have the casual community hating on a competitive look at their deck that isn't pure enough for their liking. This isn't a one-off thing either. If you play a deck that isn't the right percentage of in-archetype cards and post it in certain casual-oriented archetype servers, you will receive comments that say you're not actually playing the deck. This hate going both ways may not seem to make sense. It's just a game after all, who cares what other people are playing? If these separate communities are powered by echo chambers, what are they echoing? As we've established earlier, in Yu-Gi-Oh! Your opponent determines the amount of fun you have. If you're playing a casual deck and your opponent is playing a competitive deck, neither one of you will have fun. The casual deck will likely not be able to compete with a competitive deck, and if it does, it'll be along an unfun axis, a concept we can get into later and was covered lightly in my video on turn skips. This means a boring game for the competitive player who didn't get a competition, and a frustrating game for the casual player who didn't really get to play. In essence, both players, by their choice in deck, have broken the magic circle. Chapter 2. The Magic Circle. The magic circle, not the spellbinding circle, is a ludological concept first developed by Dutch historian John Huizinga in his groundbreaking 1938 work on the study of play, Homo Ludens, a study of the play element in culture. The magic circle is not a fundamental piece of the work, but a concept that pops up throughout it where Huizinga notes the degree of separation between the world and the rules of play versus those of reality. This idea is taken and integrated into grander theory of the same name by Eric Zimmerman and Frank Lantz in 1999 and then put into popular parlance by Zimmerman and Katie Salen 4 years later in Rules of Play. This new interpretation, now rooted in the world of video games, sees the magic circle as almost entirely divested from the real world that surrounds it. The immersion of the video game sucks the player into the world and causes them to engage with the game on the game's level. But as we know from our discussion of paratexts, no text is entirely divorced from the world that surrounds it. They all have paratexts that inform how we engage with them. Edward Castronova's Synthetic Worlds, the Business and Culture of Online Games brought this challenge just 2 years after the publication of Rules of Play. He notes that while the magic circle serves as a shield from the outside world, that shield is permeable, influenced by the outside world as much as it is separated from it. Marinka Kopier also notes this in her 2009 article Challenging the Magic Circle, How Online Role-Playing Games Are Negotiated by Everyday Life, where she notes that the ambiguity between the virtual and the real is negotiated by the player through the course of play. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not necessarily a virtual game, but that same negotiation process between the real and the game world takes place, but specifically between the players on the two sides of the table. The classic no synchro, no ixies, no pen, no links duel room is an example of that negotiation. If you enter that duel room, you are engaging in a contract of the game with no relation to the actual rules of the game. If you break that contract by bringing an access code talker, you break the magic circle and ruin the fun for the player who created that duel room. You're not just breaking the made up rules of that one person, you're breaking the rules of the false reality that their duel room created, which, importantly, is just as real as the false reality that any game creates. But why would you even want to go in there with your access code in the first place? In the competitive mindset, people who are not trying to play as competitively as possible are also breaking the magic circle by playing suboptimally on purpose and not engaging in instrumental play. Chapter 3. Instrumental Play. And there's that phrase again, instrumental play. Now that I've said it 3 times, let's break that down too. Instrumental play, as described by T.L. Taylor rather than the originator of the term Wolfgang Iser, is a goal-oriented approach to play that values efficiency, expertise, and optimization of strategies to find the best way to reach the end goal. In Yu-Gi-Oh! That end goal is either winning a game or match, or topping a tournament. If you value instrumental play over casual play, you want to optimize your deck and your playstyle to make you more likely to reach those goals. This means no casual decks, no fun-ofs, which are cards that aren't particularly good but are funny or flashy when they resolve, and no restrictions on play beyond those imposed by Konami itself, the primary arbiters of what is considered legitimate versus illegal play. I must stress though that this does not mean that instrumental play is fundamentally in opposition to fun. Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, whether they be top players or not, will gladly tell you about the joys of tournament play. It's not even just the fact that a player following instrumental play is more likely to win. If both players are engaging in instrumental play, the equivalent power level will often lead to fun matches for both sides of the equation. With a few exceptions, of course. This leads back to our example. If the competitive player enters a random duel on Master Duel with the no synchro, no ixies, no pens, no links duelist and destroys their opponent with the competitive deck, there's not much joy in that for either of them. Their opponent is not engaged in instrumental play and has thus broken the magic circle for the competitive player as much as the competitive player broke it for the casual player by entering their no synchro, no ixies, no pen, no link room earlier. Thus, both players are essentially playing the same game in such different ways that they ruin it for each other, hence the exasperated sighs in response to Blue Eyes arriving to the board while full Snake Eyes combo waits in the hand. As Castronova said, the magic circle is permeable, and player reaction and behavior is influenced by the paratext of their Yu-Gi-Oh community. Top players, and particularly the more competitive-minded YouTubers who have larger audiences than those top players, have a large influence on the mindset of their audience, and the comically exaggerated reactions that they may give to those casual decks are passed down to the general player base. They internalize the exaggerated behavior outside of the performative context in which they make sense, to a certain extent. The casual player finds the same comfort in more casually minded YouTubers and have adopted a fairly reactionary attitude to modern Yu-Gi-Oh, seeking to return it to a time when it was supposedly pure or fun. The cutoff point for this varies greatly, but it's usually the DM or GX era. The competitive players have come to call these players Yugi Boomers, a reflection of the real-world reactionary politics that their views on Yu-Gi-Oh mirror. Obviously, the only similarity between the Yugi Boomer and the political pejorative of Boomer, as opposed to the original generational terminology, is the reactionary mindset, which is not necessarily adopted wholesale. Just because someone wants to return to GOAT format doesn't mean that they're a Nazi or even generally conservative. Some of them are, but so are some competitive players. This is why we need to be careful of who we allow to be spokespeople in our communities, especially since, as we know, the things that they will say will influence their audience even through the magic circle. Casual players seeking this return will often advocate for certain floodgates that stop the opponent from playing their modern decks as usual. For the competitive player, while these floodgates are legal and powerful, they are quite annoying in how they prevent playing the game that they love. For the casual player, however, these same floodgates instead allow them to play the game that they love. Thus, you'll see many casual players, often quite smugly, proclaiming their love of skill drain or other floodgates. One should note that this only applies to the floodgates to prevent more modern playstyles, while allowing older decks to shine. Droll and Lockbird and Dimension Shifter don't seem to receive the same praise that skill drain does. Why do both casual and competitive players dislike these cards, though? Chapter 4. Floodgates and Venting. As we covered in my video on turn skips, the players who see the use of floodgates and turn skips as breaking of the magic circle get really frustrated by them, especially as the occurrences begin to pile up. This leads to the community as a whole assigning some sort of moral weight to the strategies you choose to play. And when you see someone do something bad that doesn't technically break any rules, what do? You complain about it! It's not hard to find hate or even threats of cartoonish violence towards players who use floodgates, turn skips, or even just grindier decks like Runic. This hatred has become so common that it becomes mimetic. And this time I do mean in the internet funny haha way, like the calls to ban Mystic Mine. Frankly, since that cultural moment, they've reached the point of full-on absurdity. But let's dig deeper into that whining and complaining. Two of my favorite hobbies, by the way. Whining and complaining have become the natural reaction in the competitive community to the break of instrumental play. But when does whining and complaining itself break the magic circle? Obviously, there's a certain degree to which complaining can stray into bad sportsmanship, a line that differs from person to person. Konami has their own personal line beyond any of that, where even a damn uttered in awe at a cool play is an example of bad sportsmanship. But venting on Twitter or YouTube about frustrating cards couldn't be considered by even Konami to be bad sportsmanship. Could it possibly ever break the magic circle? In the wake of growing frustrations with floodgates, several top players have given the advice of not getting frustrated, but learning how to play around such floodgates instead. Obviously, the advice only goes so far, but that's all it's really meant to do. But because top players said it, it's now part of instrumental play. If you're complaining about floodgates, you're obviously not following the rules of instrumental play and need to be corrected. Now, complaining that someone broke the magic circle for you by using cards you don't like is breaking the magic circle for other players who have decided you should only learn how to play around those cards instead. Isn't that a confusing situation? I should note, this occurrence isn't super common, yet. While plenty of people like to give unsolicited advice to follow instrumental play, hopping on people complaining about the game from a competitive standpoint is still relatively rare. Sure does happen a lot to trans women though. Huh, that's crazy. Wow, so weird. Maybe think about what that might mean about our fun little hobby and our fun little society while we dive more into how alt-format enthusiasts fit into all of this. Chapter 5. Alt-format enthusiasts and the space between. The alt-format enthusiast almost doesn't fit into the scope of this video if not for the interesting position they hold in between the casual and competitive player. The alt-format enthusiast does not enjoy the modern format, much like the casual player, but they take instrumental play seriously, just adjusted to their particular format. vtuber isn't a good deck anymore, so it's not instrumental play in advanced format. But in Time Wizard Edison format, it is. This, I think, aligns the alt-format enthusiast more with the competitive player, even if they indulge in the same nostalgic tendencies as the casual player. Importantly though, because they are applying instrumental play to old formats, they usually avoid the prelapsarian fantasies common in casual fans of Yu-Gi-Oh! They not only know what these old formats are actually like, to a certain extent, but they actively advance the theory of those moments in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, discovering new strategies with old cards. This space between the casual and instrumental play that alt-format enthusiasts illustrate is a good reminder that these categories are not firm or all-encompassing. More casually aligned players still like to win and may break out a tier 1 deck for big tournaments. More competitive aligned players quite frequently like to take the power level down a notch to play their pet deck or run a progression series or draft format game, despite Konami's reluctance to officially support this practice. Maybe as Time Wizard events continue to have such great interest, more space will be made for the Battle Pack fans out there once more. This may further create a space for casual and competitive players to interact in ways that don't cause as much friction between the two. One could argue that for these players, Konami themselves have broken the magic circle with their card design, something that should feel pretty relatable to any Yugists who lived through the vomiting horse arc of the latest Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list hysteria. When Konami's design decisions anger the community as a whole, the only logical response is to take your ball and go home. Find another way to play with your toys. It just so happens that there's a lot of illogical people in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community. Generally speaking though, the alt format enthusiasts are just pretty chill. And this is a video about people not being chill, hence why they don't really fit in the scope of this video. Let me know if you want me to do a video on why people choose alt formats in the comments, but honestly, it seems pretty obvious to me. Conclusion. Casual play is not the wrong way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Instrumental play is also not the wrong way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Alt formats are not more or less wrong ways to play than any other. There is no wrong way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! But these conflicting styles of play cause tension when they bump up against each other and break the magic circle and the perceived rules of play. Places where casual and instrumental play run into each other, like the Master Duel ladder, will inevitably cause frustration as both players' fun is ruined, despite neither player doing anything wrong. So what do? I don't know. There's not really any sort of solution to this. Master Duel and Duel Links both provide a casual ladder to help provide a space for casual-minded players to have their fun, but these areas are filled with bots grinding away to little reward, and that's not fun either. There's nothing you can do to keep casual and instrumental players from colliding besides creating your own play circles outside of these channels, which are and always should be for everyone. Really, just like the video on turn skips, this is more of an examination of Yu-Gi-Oh! Culture and a call to maybe be a little kinder to your fellow human beings. I find the interactions at play here fascinating, and I also think that when you see the forces at play, it makes it a little easier to take a step back and not be mean to people for playing Blue Eyes, playing Floodgates, or even complaining about Floodgates. It's fine to criticize aspects of the game. It's just a game after all. It's not going to be hurt by your words. Just try not to take the vitriol to the personal level just because the person across the table or across the screen enjoys the game in a different way from you. Those are words that I'm going to try to take to heart myself, and I encourage you to as well. Thanks for watching. Hey there, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've got a lot more for you if you want them. Just hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to get notifications. I'd also appreciate if you left me a like and a comment and maybe shared the video around with your friends. You can also follow me on all the usual social media sites. Just check out my website in the description below for more info. My videos are funded by my patrons and YouTube members, whose names you'll see scrolling by in these credits here. For just $1 a month, you too can find yourself here, trapped in my end screen for all eternity. In particular, I'd like to thank Haru Hayes, Fleekill, Frog Prince Michael, and Jeremiah Coatney. A big thanks to all my other patrons and to my little community as a whole. Remember to be kind to yourselves, be kind to others, and have a wonderful whatever time it is for you. Bye!